A warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on Ada Derana 24, and here we are about to discuss Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis, but mainly Sri Lanka's negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, while Sri Lanka awaits to seal a deal of a $2.9 billion IMF bailout package, and is also awaiting responses from India in terms of debt restructuring, and began talks with China once again for restructuring Sri Lanka's outstanding debt with the Chinese. Recently, the International Monetary Fund chief, Kristalina Georgieva, said that the IMF is working hard to push for debt restructuring and resolution for countries like Sri Lanka, including other countries in debt stress. At the same time, in December, when President Ranil Wickremesinghe met with World Bank, ADB, IMF and the AIIB, it was decided that Sri Lanka is in need of a coordinated assistance program to recover from the current economic crisis. But at the same time, just this week, we saw close to some 200 economists and scholars signing a document calling for extensive debt cancellation to give the Sri Lankan economy a chance to recover and survive without austerity measures. But to discuss all this, what's possible, why the IMF is here, and how Sri Lanka should come out of this crisis, I've invited to our studios an eminent panel, both physically and virtually. First, let me introduce Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, Chairman of Public Policy Think Tank Advocata Institute. A warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
We also have here Dr. Howard Nicolas, economist and social scientist, senior instructor at Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan-born economist from Holland. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Indeewari.
Joining us virtually from India, Washington-based Professor Jayati Ghosh, development economist, professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Professor Jayati Ghosh. I'd like to talk to Murtaza. You've obviously been following the developments here in terms of the negotiations and what we hear on the news, but mostly your analysis on the recent document in terms of asking the IMF to consider a bailout or package that is that sans austerity measures. How do you think this works for Sri Lanka's situation?
So let me frame the problem. Sri Lanka basically has gone to the IMF 16 times, and each time that we go is because there is something wrong with the country, I mean structurally. So we are trying to get onto the 17th program, and the challenge here is that they have done a debt sustainability analysis and said that our debt is not sustainable. So they have said that therefore they cannot lend into arrears, and under the lending into arrears program of the IMF, they will need some kind of debt restructuring, which started with the external creditors, and it looks like this time we will have to even look at some of the domestic creditors. The reason they say this is that because the debt overhang problem is too large, and it is going to impact the economic growth going forward, and therefore they want to put us into a sustainable path. Now, one conditionality that they have put forward is that before their board approves the IMF program, which comes with funding of $2.9 billion, which will be dispersed over 3 years, they also want us to get into a more sustainable macroeconomic framework. But they want a precondition is to do a restructuring of our debt. And what has happened is that we are unable to complete the restructuring until we get an in-principle agreement with the official creditors. I believe the government is negotiating with the official creditors, and we are awaiting some feedback on that.
Dr. Nicolas, you might have something to add to this as well.
I have in general terms, but actually it's based on the call by the 200 economists for debt forgiveness. And the starting point is my memory is really short term these days, but I remember in 2020, October, reading the IMF report. There, the head of the IMF congratulated all countries in the world for this huge expansion of fiscal expenditure. And not only did she congratulate them, she actually called for more, because she said, we are all in this together, basically trying to overcome the pandemic and the problems brought with it. So many developing countries were actually obliged to shut down. Countries that relied heavily on tourism had to shut down. And now we come to the current situation where there's a war in Europe. And again, we're impacted, and we're also told, look, this is for the greater good of, I don't know, maybe democracy or whatever. Again, we get hit badly. Now, what we're also being asked is to bear all of this pain on our own with no support. It sort of reminds me, I don't know if you follow what happened in the UK, where there were frontline workers who were told, look, we all have to pull together to overcome this pandemic, but after the pandemic was over, they were dumped. You know, nobody supported them. It's the same today. So all these developing countries who supported all the policy recommendations of locking down, we're left to fend for ourselves. We are alone in suffering the consequences. And this is why I think what the 200 economists have called for is eminently sensible. I mean, are we in this together? Or aren't we? Don't they bear some responsibility for helping us in this situation or not? And this is the simple question I ask.
On the other side, I'd like to turn to Professor Jayati Ghosh. Jayati, now this situation that Sri Lanka is facing is largely because Sri Lanka lacked financial discipline. So is it necessary that Sri Lanka avoids that Sri Lanka's debt be written down instead of going in for a bailout package with austerity plans like this? If you may maybe explain to us why you call for a deal without austerity measures.
I think we have to recognize that Sri Lanka's problem today is the result of both internal and external factors. There's no doubt there was corruption, there was mismanagement, there were many, many policy mistakes made. But also there has been a global phenomenon. There was the pandemic, there was a massive rise in prices after the Ukraine war. All of these have impacted many developing countries, not just Sri Lanka. But even the internal factors were actively assisted by the international community. I think we cannot absolve the IMF, the international financial institutions, and others who were actively supporting many of the policies that have brought Sri Lanka to this pass. Whether it is the fact of encouraging much greater borrowing from abroad and the international sovereign bonds that were floated, which enabled the government to take on additional debt, which is frankly unaccounted for. All of these were done under the watch of the IMF. As was mentioned, Sri Lanka has been almost continuously under IMF programs, and in many cases, these were celebrated. The most recent tax cuts were not celebrated, but the ones before that were, in fact, very much part of the IMF framework, where you reduce corporate taxes, you reduce taxes on direct incomes so as to encourage growth and incentivize growth, so-called. So many of the problems that Sri Lanka finds itself in today are the result of neoliberal strategies that were actively encouraged by the same financial institutions that are now declaring the debt is unsustainable. Yes, I think they also have to bear a burden in this. Similarly, the bondholders who demanded much higher returns, who said that we cannot give credit to Sri Lanka except on much worse terms because it's so risky. If you are getting a higher return because of a higher risk premium, you have to be willing to bear that risk. You can't turn around and say, we want the full value of our loan back. And that's exactly what is happening. So definitely a haircut is called for. It's called for from all parties, all the creditors. Yes, the bilaterals. Certainly, I would argue private sector has to be involved. The IMF has accepted this in its own common framework, which is applying only to low-income countries. But also, in fact, the IMF and the World Bank and the international multilateral creditors themselves, because they have been party to these. And unless they begin to bear some of those costs, they will continue to be, let me admit, a little irresponsible in their policy advice to many countries.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to turn to Mr. Jafferjee as well. while Sri Lanka has to look at fiscal management and maybe correct years of mismanagement in terms of policy and wrong decisions, at this current juncture, what do you think is necessary?
So, first thing is, just as much as the academics mean well, I don't agree with that view. I think it will be counterproductive for our interests. Yes, I do agree with Professor Ghosh that there was a credit risk premium embedded into these bonds, which was in the order of about 6%, about the risk-free rate for a 10-year US security. And our bonds are trading at about 30 cents to the dollar. Now, Sri Lanka, what it's asking for is restructuring, which means reprofiling, time for it to come out of this crisis so that it can pay back, and some kind of modest reduction in the principal. All that the market has already imputed, and that is why it is trading at 30 cents to the dollar. What we require now is a speedy resolution with our creditors, that they accept that Sri Lanka is not a willful defaulter, because until we defaulted, we only had something less than $50 million of usable reserves. So, we had used all our reserves to pay our creditors at huge expense to our population. So, we are good for the money because our recovery is that we are a good faith borrower, and that is what Sri Lanka should do. Now, the crisis that we created is something that we did to ourselves basically. We were quite literally living beyond our means, and we were irresponsible fiscally and to some extent monetarily also, that we fixed our exchange rate when it should have been a lot lower or more market determined. We tried to manipulate interest rates when basically inflation was increasing and there was excess amount of loosened monetary policy. So, we created this crisis, and the only way that we can come out of this in a sustainable way is to take some painful medicine, and it goes back to the problem that we have had ever since independence, that we are living beyond our means. So, we have to just go back and live within our means, and the issue here is the people who are contributing to this is that the top 20% of the households account for 51% of the income. So, most of the government policies are trying to target the poor, but it is the rich who are benefiting from all these things. So, we have to have a better targeted system, and the rich people basically are going to continue to be rich, but they have to pay their fair share of taxes.
Dr. Nicolas, what is your proposal here in how Sri Lanka should move ahead, especially with uncertainties in the global economy, a recession around the corner, and dwindling growth prospects for the entire world? While Sri Lanka is in this self-inflicted crisis, again, there is concerns about repercussions of what's happening globally. Amid all this, what analysis and forecast do you have?
Well, I think we're in this situation that we have to resolve the debt problem. So this I accept 100%. The thing is that why have we kept going back to the IMF? What is it? I mean, is it that all our policymakers are stupid? Are our bureaucrats completely corrupt and stupid? No, it's not. We have not been allowed to embark on a strategy which is widely acknowledged as the only strategy that has ever taken any developing country out of this situation of endless poverty and debt and recurrent currency and debt crises. That strategy is an export-oriented development strategy. I've given many examples in the past, and the most recent one I point to is Vietnam. They were exactly in our position. They kept going back to the IMF, and there were all these recriminations domestically, etc., etc. But then in 2012, for geopolitical reasons, they were allowed to embark on this export-oriented industrialization strategy. They survived the pandemic perfectly well. They didn't have to borrow money from anyone. Their reserves dropped, but they had accumulated $100 billion of reserves. The reserves dropped by 20 billion. But they were able to ride that storm because of this industrialization strategy where they were able to build these reserves up. Now, we didn't have any reserves because we have not had a strategy which was essentially earning foreign exchange in a systematic and sustainable manner. I keep repeating this, and I don't blame our policymakers only. I think we are restricted by a number of international bodies as well as the donor community. I mean, they don't want, let's say, lots of developing countries following the same path as other successful East Asian and now Eastern European countries. And I think that we will have these recurrent problems unless we're allowed to move down this path. And I would say, as part of our restructuring, we should consider seriously going down this export-oriented industrialization path.
Professor Ghosh, I think you might have something to add to this as well. But at the same time, I think this document prepared by close to 200 economists, including yourself, you probably based all these conclusions on certain set of data that you've analyzed. So what are these fundamentals that you looked at in the Sri Lankan economy?
Well, you know, essentially what we're saying is, in that sense, the diagnosis of the IMF, this is an unsustainable debt. It has to be cut. There is no way that Sri Lanka can recover paying the full amount of this debt and on the current terms. So it's not just a question of rescheduling. It is necessarily a haircut. And this the IMF has also recognized. Haircuts are not new. Globally, they happen all the time in private credit systems. They're happening as we speak, probably in Sri Lanka itself with regard to private corporate creditors, but they're happening all the time in capitalist credit systems. So these are not new things. When it comes to sovereign debt, it becomes a huge issue because of the complexity, and suddenly it becomes very moral and fingers are pointed and people say, you know, you're living beyond your means. I think we have to establish not Sri Lanka that have been living beyond its means. It's the elite of Sri Lanka that have been living beyond its means, assisted by a set of policies that was celebrated by the international community. Let us not forget. So in fact, the problem is that if you impose the IMF-type package, it's the poor who will suffer. It's the bottom half of the population, the ones who precisely did not benefit from that living beyond their means strategy, who are going to suffer from this. There are other issues with the broader industrialization strategy, etc. I think we can come back to that. And there is much to be said for a different industrialization strategy, which allows much greater domestic diversification away from just particular commodities and reliance on remittances and tourism and plantation. Absolutely, there is something to be said for that. But in macroeconomic terms, let us remember that, in fact, the excessive borrowing that Sri Lanka indulged in, it's relatively new. It shoots up after 2012 in particular. Again, because they're encouraged to go in for these international sovereign bonds, because the elites are the ones who benefit. And of course, yes, corrupt politicians and corrupt elites have greatly benefited in specifically Sri Lanka's case. But this is a broader problem that is evident in many countries where they are encouraged to take on borrowing that will be unsustainable. What we find now, therefore, is that this has to be restructured. Our letter is not only to the Sri Lankan government, it is dominantly to the international community, saying you have to share this burden. And it's not just a question of being nice to other countries or helping and being supportive. It is because you are responsible for this as well. You are not, you cannot be devoid of blame for the current situation. In addition to that, consider the recent crisis and the impact it's having. Sri Lanka is not alone in being on the verge of default. We have now more and more countries in Africa, for example, either defaulting already or on the verge of default. And this is, again, because of the confluence of forces globally, particularly the massive increase in prices after the Ukraine war, coming on the back of a COVID-19 pandemic that most developing countries haven't recovered from. Now, what this has meant is that these are economies already reeling under huge shocks that did not have the fiscal capacity to make their economies recover in the same way that advanced economies did. I think Dr. Nicolas already mentioned that the IMF head, Christina Georgieva, had already said that, yes, you must spend more. But when it comes to the IMF advising countries on the ground, the ones who are facing balance payments problems, they don't do that. They impose the same austerity, which we know is counterproductive. I can assure you that the United States, the European Union, Japan, the G7 would never dream of doing that in a crisis. would do counter-cyclical policies. They would expand public spending in a period of downswing. They absolutely do the opposite of what they let the IMF force countries in distress to do. So the idea of counter-cyclical spending is, in a way, it's a no-brainer. But instead, what are we told every time when countries who are faced with a perfect tsunami of multiple crises, when they face these problems, what are they told? Well, you have to suffer because you were bad before. Now you have to take the medicine. And when you take the medicine, things will get better. We know that that does not happen. There are now umpteen surveys and studies that show that the IMF conditionalities of that rigid austerity-making kind make things worse, cause countries to go deeper into recession, depression, dramatic falls in employment, increases in poverty, increases in hunger. It is so widely documented. And yet, we keep going back to that same solution. It's incredible how we tend to believe that same nonsense over and over again. In Sri Lanka's case, you've been through 16 of these already. It obviously hasn't made things better because then you end up with the next round. So clearly, it's time to rethink that strategy. And any agreement that you engage with the IMF has got to be based on a recognition that that strategy doesn't work. So in fact, it's time for countries like Sri Lanka who always feel, I would argue they approach the negotiations with the strong feeling of guilt and it's all our fault and now we have to do whatever we're told because we've been bad, to recognize that strategies that inflict further damage on the poor, like the kind of austerity that is being suggested, like the demand for a primary budget surplus within a couple of years, like the demand for no monetized budget deficit, controls on the central bank's creation of money, these are counterproductive for ordinary people. And you have to take on strategies for recovery that bear in mind the needs of the bottom half of the population. And then, yes, you have to think of different ways of diversifying your economy in the future.
Right. Right. I think Mr. Jafferjee will have something to add to this. Again, essentially, we're looking at creating a primary surplus here, creating non-debt, creating inflows to the country. But amid all that, given the crisis, do you think this is something that we can work with the international debtors, international creditors rather, and the lenders that we could expect austerity measures to be waived off by the IMF as well as the creditors to be considering Sri Lanka to take Sri Lanka's debt burden off and share it with Sri Lanka?
So with all due respects to the eminent economists, I simply don't agree with their assertion here, and I think it will be counterproductive for us. Let me give you the reasons. First of all, our debt is not odious debt. The most famous example was Haiti, which had to buy out its freedom from France, and they took a debt load which was morally and ethically wrong. We borrowed in good faith, basically. Unfortunately, our policymakers got all the policy interventions all wrong. It was very clear in early 2020 when COVID impacted us that we had a solvency problem, but our policymakers started behaving that this is a liquidity crisis, and they postponed an inevitable restructuring by 2 years. As I said, that when we defaulted, basically, we had less than $50 million of usable reserves with tremendous amount of pain to the economy which happened thereafter. If we had restructured our debt earlier, basically, the pain would have been much less and the loss to the creditors also would have been less. Now, the problem with what is being suggested here of debt forgiveness instead of what I am advocating, restructuring, and the market is already imputing what the loss is going to be because these instruments are trading at 30 cents to the dollar, is that out of the $12.5 billion worth of international sovereign bonds or Euro bonds, over $1.5 billion is owned by our banking system, basically. So if theoretically that you are going to have a debt forgiveness, not only are they facing a crisis due to the restructuring, but they will have a greater crisis and we will precipitate the collapse of our entire banking system if we were able to do a debt forgiveness. And we will come out as a bad faith borrower, and our access to the international credit markets that will be necessary after the structural changes that are necessary for our future growth is going to be impaired. And our track record basically is that this is the real first example of a sovereign default in Sri Lanka, that over the period of time we have never officially defaulted. Now, in terms of austerity, with all due respect to Professor Ghosh, I don't agree because I'm not a member of government, but I do know in all the negotiations that IMF has been very focused to ensure that there's a social safety net. And I've been in certain committees, and this president has reinvigorated the welfare board basically, and they are trying to improve the targeting. The problem is to come up with a robust method of inclusion, improving inclusion and improving exclusion and reducing inclusion, so that the people who need to get it are going to get the assistance. This is unequivocally, the IMF has said that Sri Lanka does not have a spending problem, it has a revenue problem, and they have repeatedly said that we need revenue-based consolidation. And I'll leave you with that last statistic, that 51% of national income basically accrues to the top 20% of households. The top 10% get 36%. And these new tax changes, the direct tax changes, the tax-free threshold is at about 40% of the top households. That may have to be adjusted because inflation is so high, but the burden is targeted to the richer households in Sri Lanka.
I think on that note, we'll take a short break here at Hyde Park. We'll get back to Professor Ghosh and Dr. Nicolas as well, but do stay with us. We'll return after this short break at Hyde Park. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24, and we are in conversation with an eminent panel of economists, scholars and analysts. Dr. Howard Nicolas, Sri Lankan-born economist, who is also the senior instructor at Sri Lanka, Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, chairman of Advocata Institute, a public policy think tank, as well as Professor Jayati Ghosh, development economist, is joining us right now to talk about Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis, alternative solutions if not the IMF, and how Sri Lanka should proceed with the IMF. I'd like to turn to Professor Ghosh. I think you wanted to add some comments to Mr. Jafferjee's observation on Sri Lanka's dealings with the IMF, Sri Lanka's current situation, and how Sri Lanka should work with international creditors.
Yes, I'd like to make about 3 points basically. So let me quickly begin with the idea, is the Sri Lankan debt ODS debt? I think a significant part of it is. What is ODS debt after all? It is debt that is undertaken by governments that have been unaccountable to the people, or with debt that is unaccounted for. And we do not know what the uses are and which do not appear to have benefited the people at large. We know in the case of Sri Lanka that these large fiscal deficits that were financed by international sovereign bonds, the actual use of the money from these bonds is opaque. We are demanding in our statement that a much greater clarity and sunlight on what exactly was done in terms of spending on these bonds. And we also do recognize that a lot of this was done, as I've mentioned before, with the hand clapping of the international community, but it was not something that was done necessarily through an extremely democratic participatory process in terms of how this money is to be spent. So I would argue that a significant proportion of this debt is actually ODS debt and deserves to be considered in that light. But in addition, in any case, and the IMF agrees with this, everyone agrees with this, the total amount is unsustainable. To imagine that all of this can be repaid without completely damaging the economy and bringing the population to its knees is actually wrong. So it has to be restructured, by which I mean it has to be reduced. Secondly, I just want to point out that many of the IMF conditions are deeply problematic, at least what we know of them. Of course, these are things that are going on in closed-door negotiations. We don't know exactly what is being decided, but the evidence is that the social safety net that is being talked about is essentially transfers. Basic transfers to the poor, targeted. Better targeted usually means reduced. That has been the case everywhere. Whenever they say better targeted, it means you're reducing it. But also think of what money transfers will mean in a highly inflationary situation. They will simply be priced out. You can transfer some amount of money at the beginning of a year or every 3 months, according to some budgetary allocation, and it will be worthless because of the very high rate of inflation, which already exists. You combine that with a depreciating currency, which is what will happen when you move to market-determined exchange rates, and inflation will be that much worse. So what is being called the social safety net is a bit of a, it's really a kind of, a wash. It's an attempt to pretend that you're thinking about the poor when so many other of the policies is actually going to undermine that. The minute you're looking at fiscal discipline, it really ends up, if you are not making viable means of raising resources, it's not just enough to announce there's going to be a 40% increase in direct tax revenue. You have to have very clear pathways. You have to say, we will tax the rich. We will cut down, we will ensure all bottleneck, all of the loopholes in illicit financial flows are closed. We will have a wealth tax that is significant. You have to have measures that will generate that additional revenue. If you can't generate that additional revenue, and currently the projections are frankly over-optimistic, in fact, even ridiculous, then what will happen is the only way you will meet your target is by cutting expenditure. And this has been the story over and over again. Sri Lanka is not alone. There are so many IMF cases in which exactly this has happened.
Right, right.
So there is a real concern there. Sorry, I just want to mention one other aspect, which is that of privatizing public sector enterprises. And of course, the raising of prices of fuel and electricity. It's not just that they impact everyone. It's that fuel is a universal intermediate. It impacts all other prices and the transport of all goods and many services. And this will necessarily have a further impact on inflation and therefore the living standards of the poor. Privatizing public sector enterprises, often seen as one of these means of greater efficiency. And we have seen the chaos, havoc, and inequality that it has created in so many countries. So really, we have to think very seriously about the viability of many of these measures, both in the short term and in the medium term for the Sri Lankan economy.
Right. Professor Ghosh, I think your document says that international financial institutes have been slow to respond to the crisis and are apparently requiring major policy and fiscal conditionalities from countries like Sri Lanka, especially Sri Lanka. I'd like to turn to Dr. Nicolas as well. Now, these IFIs have been working with Sri Lanka and have been trying to reach out since April 2020. I think we've been talking about the requirement to go to the IMF or not. Sri Lanka decided not to reach out to the IMF. And now we are in this crisis, but it is taking time for Sri Lanka to obtain assurances from creditors. But in the interim, either way, Sri Lanka is looking at sealing the deal and we will work with the IMF. But in the interim, how do you suggest we manage all these concerns and then going forward in managing the vulnerabilities within the country?
Sorry, Indeewari, rather than giving a direct answer to that, I'm going to add another concern of mine. I was very active, especially in policy circles, during the East Asian crisis. And one thing I observed that the IMF did, and many people believe that the IMF did it deliberately, was they delayed assistance to many East Asian countries. Now, the IMF denied that, but actually what it resulted in was making all those East Asian countries incredibly vulnerable and having a very weak bargaining position. Let me just give you an example. They delayed assistance to Thailand. Okay, the negotiations went on and on and on. And then finally, Thailand was so desperate, they actually accepted many privatizations, which were essentially handing over assets to Western banks. One in particular that I remember was the privatization. I can't remember whether it was an insurance company or a bank in Thailand, where ABN AMRO bought it for 1/20th of its value. Why? Because Thailand was desperate. And you can go right through all the other East Asian countries, and they had the same experience. I know because I met a lot of their policymakers, and they did not believe the IMF story that this was some bureaucratic mishap of the IMF, etc. This is deliberate. It strengthens the hands of the creditors, especially those holding ISBs. Now, I think there's nothing actually stopping the IMF coming quickly with emergency assistance of 2.9 billion, except the creditors won't like it. They won't like it because it strengthens Sri Lanka's bargaining hand. And I think that also has to be addressed, and the IMF has to be asked, is this a repetition of the East Asian crisis where you're deliberately withholding support to strengthen the hands of the creditors? So I want to put that on the table because I think that's very important, because if it's not, then they should explain to us why this is all taking so much time. Why is it that we seem to be going round in circles while we are actually desperately in need of that support for our foreign exchange reserves? On the privatization side, I agree totally with Professor Ghosh. We have to be very careful because we have seen what has happened in country after country. Foreigners who come in for privatizations are not interested in the privatizations of a shoe factory or distilleries corporation or something like that. They're after the natural monopolies. They're after the CEB, for example, where essentially that gives them so much power they can set whatever prices they want. And then basically it's the poorer segments of the society that lose out. One case that I have repeated many times is Sao Paulo Light. Okay, that's in Brazil. It was privatized, and after it was privatized, they called it Sao Paulo Dark, because what this energy company did was they cut off all electricity to the poorer sections that couldn't afford to pay. That's why they called it Sao Paulo Dark. Now, you're going to have this whole gamut of privatizations, and I will bet you the privatizations that are particularly interesting to the foreigners are things like energy, water, etc. In other words, natural monopolies, where once a foreign entity controls it, they can charge any price they want. And I think we have to be very careful with that. Again, we are in a very weak position, and therefore now the onus is on us to concede, essentially handing over our assets to foreigners at dirt cheap prices and actually handing them over the keys to what is essentially monopolies. We have to be very careful.
I'd like to turn to Mr. Jafferjee here. If we are to work to ensure that Sri Lanka doesn't face any challenges amid these concerns, what structural and fundamental measures should Sri Lanka take while these concerns are being raised in order to mitigate any repercussions and in order to prevent Sri Lanka falling into peril?
So the first thing is that if I think about what has happened to our country, this country has been run for the benefit of 1,000 people. It's not been run for the benefit of 22 million people. So coming out of this crisis, we have to put in the structures and systems that this country is run for the benefit of the majority of its people, not for elite. And there has been complete state and institutional capture. So the first thing is that our president has said that his vision is to have a social market economy, which I agree with. And the allocation of resources should be based on a market system, and the social part should be the distribution objective, that nobody gets left behind and everybody has a fair go in life. Now, in order to put across this system, we will have to have a system that allows sufficient competition and regulation. And our biggest challenge here is the technical capacity to be able to put in all these structures. So I do agree with Dr. Nicolas. I am a member of the SOE restructuring committee, but we are not dealing with the network industries that he's talking about, which have peculiar market structures, that they are natural monopolies, and therefore you have to be very careful that when you are unbundling, that you have the right kind of regulatory structure and the kind of regulators and the anti-competitive regulator to make sure that there is sufficient competition in the thing. So we have to tread very, very carefully, and I do agree with him on that. But again, coming out of this system, that we have to be completely pragmatic with the economic policies, that we cannot be dogmatic and stick to one ideology.
Professor Ghosh, do you think Sri Lanka can do without the IMF or these international financial institutions at this stage? Because we require these assurances from creditors in order to achieve that $2.9 billion from the IMF, although we although it is not a significant amount, these assurances will be required, and working with the IMF will be required for Sri Lanka to come out of this crisis. How do you respond?
You know, I think it's basically, as Dr. Nicolas said, it's a question of your bargaining power. Yes, at the moment Sri Lanka is very weak, and increasingly it might appear desperate. But let's also place this loan in perspective. $2.9 billion spread over 4 years. That's a very, very small amount per month. It's very little, okay? From what I know, the need for essential imports is about $10 billion per year. Your own foreign exchange earnings from what you're getting in the plantation exports and all the other exports and the remittances and so on, is about $15 billion per year. In the very, very worst case scenario, you must restrict your imports to the essential imports, which are also the imports that matter for the people. And you must emphasize expanding your export revenues. If you say the only option is the IMF, then you really place yourselves in a much worse bargaining position. If you tell the IMF, yes, we will take your loan, but not if it means imposing any of the conditions that would harm the people, or impact on the privatizations that have been mentioned, or cause further inflation in the economy, then yes, but you have to have that strength of mind and say that in the immediate term, we will cope in a way that we will actually manage our immediate needs of foreign exchange, which can be done if you are determined to do so. And then we will bargain with the rest of the world. If everyone perceives you as weak and desperate, then they will treat you accordingly and they will extract the maximum. And it will not be in the interests of the economy in the long term, and it will not be in the interests of the people in the short term.
In creating these non-debt inflows and spurring economic growth through exports and tourism, we've had a tough few years. Do you think all this is possible within a short period of time?
No, I'm just going by what you have at the moment. You have about $15 billion coming in on the existing strategy. And the estimates for essential imports, the Sri Lankan government came up with $5 billion for 6 months. I'm assuming it's $10 billion for a year. So it's really a question of how much you're willing to extend in terms of the other costs.
Right. Thank you, Professor Ghosh. Mr. Jafferjee?
Yeah. So in order for us to have stabilization, we have to reduce our spending, because you can't try to export your way out of this crisis. If you are going to grow, basically that is something that you will have to create more exports, because it will improve productivity in your economy and make a lasting competitive advantage. But at the moment, because there is excess amount of spending, that is what we have to tighten, which has to be through taxes and interest rates, which is what they are trying to do as a stabilization measure. But then the other part of our challenge is that in 2023, if we manage to do stabilization, and the expectation is that the economy is going to contract again, but to a lesser extent, it's expected 1 to 2%, that thereafter that we put in the policies and structures and the right kind of incentives to encourage the kind of growth that will make us stronger. What we did previously is basically we borrowed overseas and we stimulated non-tradable sectors. So we misallocated all the resources and we thought that we were rich. But one day the debt came due, like what happened to us, and now we can't pay.
Dr. Nicolas, I think the budget, the recent budget also looked at a lot of structural changes, and here we're talking about cash transfers to the poor and also restructuring state-owned enterprises. How do you analyze Sri Lanka's policies going forward? Because the president himself said we're looking at beyond 2025, somewhere at 2045 and beyond. How do you analyze the proposals and what's done so far? Is there more needed to be done?
So I'll answer that and just also address a couple of things that were said earlier. For me, whenever you look at privatization as a country, your main consideration is how is it going to help my competitiveness? You don't privatize if it is not going to improve your competitiveness. You don't privatize if it's going to raise energy costs. You don't privatize if it's going to raise water costs. You don't privatize if it's going to raise transport costs. Now, many countries have actually done this privatization for ideological reasons and suffered the consequences. UK is one of those. They privatized railway, it's a disaster. They privatized airports and handed it over to one company, UK Airports Authority, and now everybody agrees it's been a disaster. The Daily Telegraph, which actually was promoting privatizations, came out and said that after the privatization, the business traveler spent 40 minutes extra for each time they traveled, which has a huge cost for the society. So it shouldn't be done on ideological basis, but rather it should be done on commercial basis. Is this helping us? Can we get better management? Can we get better technology, etc., etc.? So I'm not against privatization per se. I'm actually very much in favor of it. But you have to do it for the right things and the right reasons. The other thing that I wanted to come back to is, I think we made a serious mistake going down the ISB road. And I think we can redress that by talking to bilaterals. Now, there are countries that are interested in Sri Lanka. There are multinational corporations that are interested. What we have to do is to say, okay, we're open for business, but we want to switch out of commercial loans towards bilaterals again. And as part of this, we're interested in your companies coming here. So it's not just that we're going with the begging bowl to these countries and saying, please give us a concessional loan. No, it's part and parcel of an overall commercial link to countries. I'll give again the case of Vietnam. Who is building their metro? Who has built all their bridges? Who has built many of their roads? Japanese, Koreans. Why? Because they brought Japanese companies in. They've brought Korean companies. And you know who is now following? Germans. And what are they doing with the EU? They're asking for concessional loans. So I think this is the way we have to think, because commercial loans are not really the way to go. We need the bilaterals. We need to go back to a much more secure international funding. And in the end, we don't need that. But we actually go down that road initially to attract the foreign investors as well, because once they see their countries actually lending to Sri Lanka in the context of doing business with Sri Lanka, then I think we're opening more doors for ourselves.
I think we have just a few minutes to wrap up the show. So I'd like to open the floor to comment on Dr. Nicolas's comments on ISBs as well as state-owned enterprises. I'd like to ask Ms. Jafferjee, because you're in the committee, how that's going. Maybe we could go to Professor Ghosh and then ask you your comments on ISBs and as well as state-owned enterprise restructure, the efforts here in Sri Lanka, and then turn to you.
Yes. So let me comment about the ISBs. You see, the problem is that money is fungible. And what happened is that when we started develop and we became a middle income country, the access to certain multilateral lending was reduced. So you were called a market access country. And then we started, because we lived beyond our means, we had to keep on borrowing to pay for all the large amount of imports. So we started accessing commercial markets. And initially after the conflict, there was a lot of inflow into domestic securities. And then when the interest rate environment changed globally, there was outflow of those securities and we had to refinance. So actually a lot of these Eurobonds, or what we are calling ISBs here, the purpose is that it went into refinancing existing debt. The nature of the security changed. That's how most of this came about, and it went into the general treasury. Now, Dr. Nicolas is talking about bilateral, but bilaterals lend to projects basically. These were borrowed for funding the general treasury and for refinancing. Then you come to the question of state-owned enterprise. There is another angle that has to be brought in, the cultural context and practices of your country. Everybody dreams of a Singapore kind of Temasek, but that was a unique for every Lee Kuan Yew, there were 50 Robert Mugabes. And the reality is that the political system in this country, etc., it doesn't encourage good governance. So therefore, the precondition of the state-owned enterprise of good governance is not there, because it is the politicians who decide who is going to govern these entities, and it is not based on a merit basis. Second thing is the issue of what is called competitive neutrality, that some of these SOEs are competing with private companies, and there is a significant distortion in the level playing field because they are benefiting from certain advantages. These SOEs also have upstream and downstream customers. Take the case of the electricity. So we are all consumers of electricity, but because there's mismanagement and mainly underpricing, you have power cuts basically. That does more harm basically than saying holding down prices. So if you give me the option between higher tariffs and power cuts, I would any day accept higher tariffs because I can self-impose a power cut on myself if I can't afford it. If the utility cuts it on some arbitrary thing, then my flexibility is completely impacted.
Right. We just have 2 minutes, Professor Ghosh, for your closing remarks.
First, on the issue of the state-owned enterprises, I think I would go very much with what Dr. Nicolas said, that essentially you have to look at what they're doing and what impact they have on the rest of the economy. And one of the critical problems with privatization, very broadly speaking, if it is such a corrupt state that all the public sector enterprises are also in effect corrupted by them, then selling all of them to private enterprises just gives you corrupt crony capitalism. If everything is so bad in terms of the state and the lack of accountability. So it doesn't solve the problem by handing it over. What it does do is generate massive exclusion. And that is absolutely the problem. I think the example that was just given is very telling. I can self-impose a power cut on myself if I can't afford it. Who are the people in the country who will not be able to afford power? And is that what you want to do to the country? Is to tell the poor that they don't get electricity? So I think there's a real problem in terms of which sectors you privatize, how you privatize them, and what you think you will gain out of them. And the principles that were just mentioned in terms of what Dr. Nicolas said are actually very valid, that you do it in terms of what you will gain in the economy, in terms of competitiveness, but also bearing in mind the needs of the macroeconomy and of inclusion and of avoiding greater poverty among the people. Finally, in terms of ISBs, there's really no case for the ISBs. They were promoted as a means of allowing cheap access to credit at a time when global interest rates were incredibly low. Right now, that's not the case. And what they do is generate volatility. And because they are opaque, they also generate much greater potential for corruption, precisely along the lines that was just being mentioned. So I really think there's a case for shifting financing very dramatically away from ISBs. The great idea, since they're trading at 25-30% in the secondary market, is to actually purchase them and get rid of some of your debt.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ghosh, development economist, who's a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Thank you once again for joining us from India. We also had with us Dr. Howard Nicolas, economist, social scientist, who is a senior instructor at Sri Lanka, joining us to talk about Sri Lanka's way forward. And thank you to you once again, Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, chairman of public policy think tank Advocata Institute. Thank you for joining us, for sharing your thoughts here at Hyde Park. We were discussing Sri Lanka's way out of the crisis, dealing with the IMF and alternative solutions to Sri Lanka's economy. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion. Good night.